In this video, we will discuss generative adversarial networks. Generative adversarial networks build a generative model of the data. These methods can be viewed as alternatives to the variational autoencoder. However, unlike a variational autoencoder, which has an encoder and a decoder portion, a generative adversarial network builds an unsupervised model of the data through the notion of adversarial training. Generative adversarial networks create an unsupervised generative model of the data. What this means is that you can input noise samples to a generative adversarial network, to the generator portion of a generative adversarial network, and it will output samples that are representative of a training data set. The generative adversarial network can be viewed as an alternative to the variational autoencoder. Recall that in an earlier lecture, we had discussed a variational autoencoder in which we can input noise samples and the output contains data samples which are representative of the distribution of the training data. However, there is a significant difference between how the training of a generative adversarial network is done and how the training of a variational autoencoder is done. A variational autoencoder has an architecture which looks like an autoencoder. That means that it has both an encoder portion and a decoder portion. The encoder portion receives the training samples, converts them into a code, and then it decodes them into the output samples. So at least during the training phase, the variational autoencoder does see the training samples. However, during the generative phase, the encoder in a variational autoencoder can be thrown away and only the decoder portion can be used. However, in a generative adversarial network, there is no training of an encoder portion. Only a decoder is trained, and so a generative portion of a generative adversarial network, which is your decoder, does not directly see the training data. Instead, the generative portion indirectly receives feedback from a discriminator as to whether or not its generated samples are realistic. So let us discuss the notion of adversarial training, which is used in a generative adversarial network. In a variational autoencoder, we have a decoder and an encoder. And the decoder and the encoder are trained together in order to learn the generative model of the data which is inside the decoder. Of adversarial training, we have a generator and a discriminator. Now the generator looks a lot like a decoder of an autoencoder, and the discriminator is a lot like a classifier. So this discriminator, it has access to training samples and it's a classifier to distinguish between real and fake samples. And the generator tries to create samples whose main goal is to fool the discriminator. That means that the generator tries to create samples that are as realistic as possible so that the classifier cannot distinguish between the real and the fake samples. And in adversarial training, there is a simultaneous training of the generator and the discriminator, and these two obviously have opposite objectives, because the discriminator has the job of directly identifying which are the real samples and which are the fake samples, whereas the generator is trying to generate samples whose main goal is to fool the discriminator. So it's helpful to think of a generator as a counterfeiter, which is trying to create counterfeit samples that the discriminator will think are real samples. So the discriminator is like a police which is trained to identify between real and fake samples, whereas the generator is a counterfeiter which tries to create realistic fake samples. So let's look at how the training of the generator and the discriminator is performed. So we'll first start by introducing some notations and definitions. So let Rm be a set of m randomly sampled examples from the real data set. Now m is essentially your mini batch size. Sm is a set of m synthetically generated samples. These synthetically generated samples, they are generated by the generator. And the way the generator generates these samples is that it is like your decoder of an autoencoder, which means that it takes, now a decoder has a code which is created by the encoder. However, in the case of the generator, the decoder just takes in p-dimensional Gaussian noise samples. So in a sense, it can be any p-dimensional Gaussian noise sample, and using any p-dimensional Gaussian noise sample, you can apply the generator to this noise sample as the input to create the generated samples, this GZ1 through GZM. So these GZ1 through GZM are the generated samples which look as close to the training data as possible. So its inputs are simply Gaussian noise samples. These Gaussian noise samples essentially decide what kinds of samples it will generate. So essentially, for example, if you have an image data set with 1,000 classes, so if you have these Gaussian noise samples, then in different parts of your Gaussian distribution, it's going to generate images from different classes. So here I have shown the neural architecture for the GAN. This is in fact the neural architecture for training the generator. So in a sense, if you look at the first part of the architecture, you can see that it has a code. It takes as input the noise sample. So this is a sample noise from a prior distribution, which is typically Gaussian. So for example, it could be a 100-dimensional Gaussian distribution. It could be a standard Gaussian distribution to create M samples, and depending on the value of the Gaussian sample, the decoder is going to create synthetic samples. So the synthetic sample is essentially a counterfeit which feeds into the discriminator. Now this discriminator is nothing but a classifier. You can train it like a classifier, but the important point is that you train the classifier simultaneously with training the generator. So now while training the generator, you will hook up this discriminator to the generator in the way I have shown in the figure, and the output is the probability that your sample is real. So this synthetic sample which was created by the generator, you want it to be as real as possible, and so the loss function will push the counterfeit to be predicted as real. So while you're training a generator, in a sense the loss function will push the counterfeit, and when you do backpropagation on this hooked up network, you're only going to update the parameters of the decoder, which is the generator. Now note that this generator portion, it looks like the decoder portion of an autoencoder, but the encoder is missing. So here we are only training the decoder portion, and the input code is essentially a sample noise from prior distribution, which is your Gaussian distribution. So now let's look at the discriminator objective function. The discriminator is essentially a classifier. So dx is the discriminator output probability that the sample x is real. And so your maximization objective function, you want to maximize the probability that real examples. So you have this mini batch of m real examples and m synthetic examples. And what the discriminator is going to do, it's going to set up a maximization objective function which is going to be maximized when your real examples have as high a probability of being real as possible. So you can see that's log dx, but your synthetic examples, you want to minimize the probability. So it's 1 minus dx. So it's 1 minus the probability that the sample x is real. So for the synthetic examples, so this is how you train your discriminator. So in a sense, your discriminator is trying to correctly classify the examples. So the discriminator will be shown examples of real data as well as fake data, and the objective function will be maximized when the real examples are correctly classified and the synthetic examples are correctly classified to 0. Now let's look at the generator objective function. So the generator creates m synthetic samples Sm, and the goal is to fool the discriminator. So the objective is to minimize the likelihood that these samples are flagged as synthetic. So the objective function Jg for the generator can be written as minimize over G, Jg log of 1 minus dx. So now note that these are synthetic samples, so you're trying to minimize the probability of correct classification. So in a sense, you're trying to fool the discriminator. Now note that here you're minimizing over G. This is very important to note. So you can see the minimization is over the generator parameters, and here in the case of the discriminator, you can see you're maximizing over D, the discriminator parameter. So So you can see here that the set of discriminator parameters, they have a different object, they have a maximization objective, where the generator parameters, they have a minimization objective. Now, of course, these objectives look a little bit different, because in the discriminator, you are using the real examples, you're summing up over the real and the synthetic examples. And in the case of a generator, you are doing this only over the synthetic example. But that doesn't really matter, because the real examples, they are independent of the parameters of the generator, because the generator is not generating the real example. So in a sense, you can write JD is equal to JG plus term independent of the generator parameters. So in a sense, what you can do is that minimizing JG with respect to generator parameter is the same thing as minimizing JD with respect to the generator parameters. So in a sense, what you want to do is that you want to maximize JD with respect to the discriminator parameter, and you want to minimize it with respect to the generator parameter. So you can actually write this entire formulation as a minimax formulation, where you are maximizing over the discriminator and minimizing over the generator, and you have this JD. So you have two sets of parameters, and in a sense, now how do you solve this type of minimax problem? So you can take this objective function, this JD, and you can alternately perform the updates with respect to the generator and discriminator parameters. So the updates for the generator parameters are gradient descent parameters, because it's a minimization problem, and the updates for discriminator are gradient ascent parameters. And it is common to use k steps of the discriminator for each step of the generator. So this is essentially the backpropagation algorithm, and it's increasingly common to train neural networks simultaneously in many applications. So we already saw one example of this when we were studying actor-critic methods in the case of reinforcement learning. So there are many applications like this where you train neural networks simultaneously. So now there's some additional adjustments that you can perform during the early optimization iteration. So instead of maximizing the dx for the log dx for each x element of SM, you can maximize the log dx. So for the generator, you can maximize the log dx for each x which is in the synthetically generated, instead of minimizing log 1 minus dx. And this kind of alternative objective function sometimes works better during the early iterations of optimization, because in a sense, you are maximizing dx is the same thing as minimizing 1 minus dx. So in a sense, you are going in the same direction, but faster learning will be achieved if during the earlier phases you change the objective function a little bit. Now, here is an example of the kind of convolutional neural network which is used for image generation. So this is from the Radford Meds Chintala paper, where they have a 100-dimensional Gaussian distribution. This is only the decoder network, and it generates the output, which are basically a bunch of images. So it takes a 100-dimensional Gaussian input, and it produces the output. You can see that the output has a depth of 3. The output layer has a depth of 3 because those correspond to their 3 color maps. And it's a 64 cross 64. So this is a deconvolutional network, and the book contains some more details of this particular architecture. Now from the same paper, I am showing some examples of generated bedrooms, and you can see all of these generated bedrooms, they look very realistic. They reflect the nature of the training data, but the bedrooms are not exactly like the training data. They take their elements, the features are learned from the training data, but the actual images, they are typically distinct from the training data. Now, another interesting point is that what happens if for a particular input, now note that here your input is a Gaussian sample. So this is a 100-dimensional Gaussian sample which is input. Now one thing which one can do is that one can slowly change this Gaussian sample. So for a particular Gaussian sample, you will have a particular output, a particular type of image. Now let's say that you change it by epsilon, this Gaussian input sample that you input, and you'll get an image which is closely related. So there were actually some experiments done in this paper where they generated images from a sequence of Gaussian samples which are closely related to one another. So they slowly they change the Gaussian sample along a line, and they see what the generated images look like. So here is an example of what the generated images look like when you slowly change the Gaussian sample. Now look at the lowermost set. You can see the lowermost set, there is as you're changing the Gaussian sample, suddenly a window appears. So you can see that there is no window. There's a couch here, but there's no window. But slowly this pillow, it morphs into a window over the course of changing your input noise sample. So you can see that different portions of the synthetic input, they have different types of significance. So there is certain significance to your Gaussian noise sample, what it generates. And in fact, the synthetic noise sample, you can even do vector arithmetic on it. So what do I mean by vector arithmetic? So what you can do is that, let's say that you generate a lot of images of faces, using this approach, and from these images of faces you pick out all the generated images which correspond to smiling women, and you look at the noise sample. So for here you have an input as a noise sample on the extreme left. So you take all these 100-dimensional inputs which correspond to the smiling woman, and similarly you take all the 100-dimensional inputs in your generated data which correspond to the neutral woman, and similarly you generate you store all the synthetic inputs which correspond to your neutral man, and you average them out. So you have an average of the synthetic sample for a smiling woman, you have an average of the 100-dimensional synthetic sample for a neutral woman, and you have an average of the 100-dimensional input for a neutral man. Note that you are averaging here over the inputs, not over the outputs. So you have these averaged noise samples for the smiling woman, neutral woman, and neutral man, and you perform this vector arithmetic, and you'll get a noise sample. Now when you take that noise sample, you feed it into this decoder over here, what you're going to get outputs which look like a smiling man. So this is a very interesting kind of observation, and this kind of observation, it is seen in other types of applications. So for example, even in word2vec, there are certain types of vector arithmetic that you can perform on the engineered representations of the words. Now, there is another variation of generative adversarial network which are referred to as conditional generative adversarial networks. In conditional generative adversarial networks, you add an additional conditioning. So the idea here is that you will have pairs of images. So let's say that you have an artist sketch of an image, and you have the real image. So here I have shown there's an artist sketch of an image which is your conditional input, and you have a generator extrapolation from the sketch. Now note that in the case of your vanilla generative adversarial network, there was no conditioning. So here you're saying that with this additional, so you feed it pairs. So while training the generator, you will feed it pairs of the sketches as well as the real samples, and the goal again is to fool the generator and fool the discriminator that where the sample is real. So again you will do the same type of adversarial training, except that now this adversarial training is conditioned on the inputs. So and similarly for the discriminator also will be trained in with this conditioning for both for real and fake inputs. Now here what is going to happen is that when you do this type of training, you can actually use the generator to fill in the missing characteristics of images. So for example, you can show it the sketch of a purse, and it's going to so you look at the lower right. So the generator will be trained in such a way that you can show the generator a sketch of a purse, is going to produce a realistic purse. You show it an image of a road, upper left the input, the output will be a realistic photo of a road. And similarly, if you look at the lower left, the input is a satellite image and the output is a street map. So you can train it over pairs of images. So this is like image to image translation. So you can use adversarial training even to perform image to image translation. You can also do conditioning over text to images. So here the conditioning is by using text captions, and the output is an image which has the characteristics of that caption. So here I have shown some examples of text to image translation. This is from the Scott Reed paper. So here you can see, for example, upper left, this small bird has a pink breast and crown and black primaries and secondaries. And you can see that the bird also has those, the generated bird will also have those characteristics. Now note that these types of capabilities are also enabled by the variational autoencoder, and we discussed that in a previous lecture. So in a sense, both the variational autoencoder and the generative adversarial network, they have similar capabilities in terms of the types of applications in which they can be used. Now, there's another important point is that you notice that we did image to image translation as well as text to image translation. You can also go the other way. You can do image to text translation. Now that is image captioning, which we discussed in an earlier lecture on recurrent neural networks. You can also even use the approach for vanilla classification, because after all, if you can do any type of translation, you can do a translation from a text to an image, from an image to a text, from an image to a class. But the point is that these types of approaches are not well suited to these simpler special cases, because the simpler special cases like captioning or classification, they can be handled by supervised learning. And it makes a lot more sense to use this approach when the target is more complex in the conditioning, where some level of generative creativity is required. So in cases where you have the caption and you're trying to get to the image, more generative creativity is required. So in those cases, it makes more sense to use a generative adversarial network. And let's look at the comparison with a variational autoencoder. So here in the variational autoencoder, in the case of generative adversarial network, only a decoder, that is only a generator is learned, and the encoder is not learned in the learning process of a generative adversarial network. So in a sense, you cannot use a generative adversarial network to reconstruct a specific input sample. In the case of a variational autoencoder, you can do that because it learns both an encoder portion as well as a decoder portion. The other difference between a generative adversarial network and a variational autoencoder is that when you're looking at it from the perspective of just generating samples, the generative adversarial network generally produces samples of better quality. And the reason for this is that the adversarial approach, trying to always fool the discriminator, it is specifically designed to produce realistic images. On the other hand, the variational autoencoder, the regularization of the variational autoencoder actually hurts the quality of generated objects. And in fact, there's an averaging effect in the variational autoencoder when you have a loss function where you're averaging over many images. And that is why the constructed images tend to be more blurry in the case of the variational autoencoder as opposed to a generative adversarial network.